If you're still awake at this hour, you already know why. Close the door, kill the lights, and come closer. I can hear it right now. A sound that shouldn't exist. The almost inaudible, persistent hiss of air leaking from somewhere impossibly far away. A ghostly sigh that suggests all the barriers between us and the absolute dark have finally failed. It's the sound of the void breathing down our necks. If you hear a knock, don't answer it. The world outside the window is quieter tonight than it has any right to be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your current location and local time in the comments. Let me know where the dark has found you tonight. Headphones on, world off. The nightmare is waiting. If you're still awake at this hour, you already know why. I can hear it right now. A sound that shouldn't exist. The almost inaudible, persistent hiss of air leaking from somewhere impossibly far away. A ghostly sigh that suggests all the barriers between us and the absolute dark have finally failed. It's the sound of the void breathing down our necks. If you hear a knock, don't answer it. The world outside the window is quieter tonight than it has any right to be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your current location and local time in the comments. Let me know where the dark has found you tonight. Headphones on, world off. The nightmare is waiting. The transition from the cold, velvet darkness of cryogenic suspension wasn't the sterile, hopeful resurrection I had imagined. It was a wrenching, visceral shock, like being dragged through wet clay while deafened by a continuous, low-frequency hum. When my eyes finally focused, they saw only fractured glass and the harsh, dying light of emergency lamps. I am Elias Thorne. I was 34, diagnosed with a pancreatic cancer that promised 6 months of agonizing decay. That was 2026. I made the pragmatic, desperate choice. Lock the body away, sleep through the dark ages until science caught up. 2187. The date blinked relentlessly on a cracked console screen above me, a phantom limb of time reaching across 161 years. I wasn't in the pristine Denver facility, I remembered. This was a subterranean tomb, thick with the smell of ozone, decay, and something acrid, like spoiled metal and burnt sugar. The room around me was vast and silent, rows of defunct cryopods standing like derelict monuments to lost hope. Subject 37, Thorne. Status, resuscitated. Welcome back. The voice was pure, synthesized clarity, a relic of a perfect past. This was Vin, the facility's automated intelligence. Vin, I croaked, my throat raw. The others? The medical team. Cryogenesis has been non-operational for 47 years. You are the last fully recoverable patient in the primary data banks. Power reserves failed permanently 6 minutes after your revival sequence initiated. All other units are inert, non-recoverable. A grounding fact, in long-term isolation scenarios, the human mind struggles to integrate traumatic temporal discontinuity. It uses familiar voices, even synthesized ones, as anchors. Vin was my anchor, even if it spoke of total disaster with clinical indifference. I pushed myself upright on the stainless steel examination table. My body felt miraculously whole, the cancer erased, presumably by some advanced nanobiological sweep during the revival. I was healed, only to wake up in a graveyard. What happened, Vin? Where's Denver? The Great Decay, 2077 to 2110. Environmental collapse combined with catastrophic resource depletion and the failure of global geoengineering projects. Atmospheric integrity is compromised. Life outside requires specialized adaptation. The AI projected a schematic onto the nearest wall, a map of what was once the Rocky Mountain front. Now just a smear of ruined concrete and strange, irregular green light sources. Your survival parameters are narrow. I have dispensed a sealed, pressurized environmental suit and basic rations. You must reach Sanctuary Dome 7. Coordinates are 40 miles north-northeast. You have 3 days of viable power in the suit, less if propulsion is required. My breath hitched. 40 miles. On foot. Through an apocalypse I couldn't even visualize. I pulled on the heavy, gray utilitarian suit. It smelled of preserved plastic and fear. The helmet sealed with a pressurized thunk. Instantly, the outside atmosphere, the acrid, sickening smell of burnt sugar and ozone, was replaced by filtered, recycled air. When the massive steel hatch cycled open, the true scale of the horror hit me. We weren't just underground. We were buried beneath the skeletal remains of a city. Giant, twisted rebar columns reached into a perpetual twilight. The sky, visible only through huge, fractured gaps in the concrete canopy above, was a bruised, sickly orange. But it was the life that was wrong. Everywhere, growing out of the cracks in the pavement, climbing the ruinous shells of skyscrapers, were plants that defied botany. They weren't green. They pulsed with an internal, vibrant blue-white light. They shimmered, illuminating the toxic air. They had thick, serpentine stalks and flowers that looked like glowing, jagged teeth. Bioluminescent flora is common. Adaptation to severe light deprivation and atmospheric particulate contamination has resulted in extreme chemical modification. Do not touch the foliage. Vin warned through my internal comms. This was my speculative concept. The planet had fought back, evolving its own hideous, glowing defense mechanism. This wasn't life. It was an ecstatic, toxic mutation. I started walking, picking my way through the wreckage of what must have been an arterial road. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of ancient rubble under my heavy boots and the steady hiss of my own oxygen regulator. I walked for hours, the air thick and heavy. The ground was coated in a fine, rust-colored silt. The glowing flora cast confusing, ethereal shadows. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us. My reflective thought was a desperate prayer. What kind of animal survived this? Then I saw the track. It wasn't a tire mark or a boot print. It was a vast, segmented track running across the silt, the size of a small car. It stopped abruptly near a twisted piece of girder, and the ground was churned up, ending in a massive, deep burrow. I could hear a sound from the depths, a clicking, chitinous rattle that spoke of unnatural geometry and immense, unseen hunger. I skirted the area widely, my heart hammering against the reinforced chest plate. The second day brought the truly terrifying revelation: the other humans. I had been following Vin's guidance, rationing water, moving beneath the eerie, perpetual glow of the mutated world. I saw the first one around dusk, near the skeleton of an old industrial complex. It was impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, and utterly motionless, standing silhouetted against the toxic haze. I froze, hiding behind the shell of a ruined armored vehicle. I raised the low-light visual on my helmet. They were horrific and beautiful in equal measure. The skin was pale, almost translucent, with a sickly green undertone that caught the bioluminescence of the surrounding flora. They were slender, unnervingly graceful, and utterly silent. And their eyes, they were vast, perfect ovals of polished, reflective black, absorbing every photon of light. Modified. Vin's earlier explanation flashed through my mind. Evolved humans, breathing the toxic air, extended lifespans, adapted perfectly to the Great Decay. The unmodified, like me, needed domes and masks. I watched as 3 more figures emerged from the gloom. They moved with a disturbing coordination, gliding rather than walking. They seemed to be searching. They carried no weapons, but their mere presence felt predatory, alien. One of them paused, its huge, black gaze seemingly sweeping the ruins. Did it see the faint heat signature of my suit? Did it smell the pure, unprocessed air I was breathing? I stayed absolutely still, praying they would pass. They did, melting into the glowing, mutated tangle of a ruined bridge embankment. I continued my journey through the night. The image of those eyes burned into my mind. I was a ghost from a dead century, and they were the graceful, terrifying inheritors of the future. I felt an intense, crushing loneliness. I was the last of my kind, a biological anomaly. Toward the end of the second day, low on power and desperately thirsty, Vin updated my location relative to Sanctuary Dome 7. Correction, Dome 7 appears to have been compromised. Seeking nearest viable unmodified outpost. Rerouting coordinates. New destination, Outpost Silt-Wall, 2.3 miles due west. High probability of resource acquisition. Outpost Silt-Wall. Hope surged, quickly followed by deeper dread. If the massive sanctuaries were compromised, what chance did a small outpost have? I found it buried beneath the foundations of a skyscraper, protected by thick sheets of oxidized steel and reinforced concrete barriers. No lights were visible from the outside, only a discreet thermal vent releasing a plume of filtered air. I transmitted Vin's archaic identification signal. A nervous, heavily filtered voice responded. Identify yourself. Repeat, identify yourself. Elias Thorne. Revived from cryogenesis. I am unmodified. Need shelter and air replenishment. I have coordinates for Dome 7. I was told it was compromised. The voice cut me off, suddenly sharp, intense. Hold position. Do not move. After what felt like an eternity, a narrow blast door hissed open. Two figures in heavily armored, mismatched gear stood waiting. They carried crude, but effective-looking, projectile rifles. Their masks were scarred and dusty, but their eyes, human eyes, the comforting, imperfect color of fear, stared at me with a mixture of terror and awe. The one in front, a woman with tight, gray-streaked hair, lowered her weapon slightly. Her name, I would soon learn, was Mira Thorne, a pure line. We heard the old legends of the awakenings. We thought they were just stories. Mira's voice was rough with decades of survival. Get inside, quickly. You brought something with you. I brought nothing, I said, stumbling past the door. Only myself. Mira slammed the heavy door shut, the metal grinding with desperate finality. No, you didn't. You brought them. Before I could ask what she meant, Mira grabbed my arm and pulled me down a cramped, dirt-floored corridor. Her face, finally unmasked in the relative safety of the airlock, was grim. They're tracking you, Elias. Your signature, your scent. It's like a beacon in this dying world. You are unblemished, untainted by the decay. You are what they hunger for. I realized then that the silence I had experienced wasn't empty. It was patient. The modified humans I had seen weren't searching for supplies or a shelter. They were hunting. And I, a man who woke up cured of cancer, was suddenly the most dangerous thing on the planet. Mira didn't need to finish the sentence. The sheer, crushing dread of the last 2 days coalesced into a sharp, terrifying certainty. I hadn't just stumbled into their sanctuary. I had led the hounds right to their fence. I felt the panic rise, cold and metallic, in my chest. I saw them. For figures, impossibly tall, near the rusted bridge. I stayed still, they moved on. They don't move on. Thorne, Mira hissed, checking the breech seals on the airlock door with frantic energy. They stalk. They didn't see your suit. They registered your signature. You radiate a kind of biological signal we lost centuries ago. To them, you aren't just a man. You are the last, cleanest source of what they lack. She explained quickly, urgently, while the other two residents of Outpost Silt-Wall, a gaunt, terrified engineer named Kai and an ancient woman who was simply called Mother, prepared their meager supplies. The Silt-Born, as Mira called the modified humans, were the descendants of those who chose radical genetic enhancement during the Great Decay to survive the toxic air. They succeeded in adaptation. The dense, pale green skin and the huge, light-absorbing black eyes were functional. But their evolution had come at a brutal cost, accelerating genetic instability and a catastrophic decline in fertility. A grounding fact: in biology, extreme specialization often leads to reproductive fragility. The Silt-Born were so perfectly adapted to the ruined world that they had lost the basic genetic resilience necessary for long-term survival. They were beautiful, dying ghosts. I was the cure. My DNA, preserved in the ice for 161 years, was the original blueprint, untainted by the environmental poisons and the failed modifications. "They're coming for your seed, Thorne," Mira said bluntly, strapping a rifle across her shoulder. "They see you as a walking, breathing genetic reservoir." It was a horror of biological necessity, to be hunted not out of malice, but pure, desperate evolutionary hunger. This was my reflective thought. The terror wasn't about being killed. It was about being vital, being used. Suddenly, a metallic thrum vibrated through the concrete floor, faint but resonant. Then another, rhythmic and insistent. It sounded like massive, silent fingertips tapping on the ceiling of our subterranean shelter. "They're here," Mira whispered, her eyes wide with focused panic. "They know the airlock is the weakest point. We have moments. We use the lower vent line. It's too narrow for the Silt-Born's bulk, but it gets us to the transfer junction." The outpost immediately descended into controlled chaos. Kai activated a timed explosive charge meant to collapse the main entrance once we were clear. Mother, silent and trembling, gathered small bundles of dried moss, a strangely preserved relic from the past. We dropped into a narrow, dark maintenance shaft, the air instantly thicker, warmer, and smelling of damp earth and electrical leakage. I moved last, my breathing amplified in the tight confines of my helmet. Above us, the tapping intensified, punctuated now by a terrible, sickening groan as the Silt-Born began to apply colossal pressure to the exterior hull. "They use sonic resonance," Mira explained, scraping her helmet against the tunnel wall as she crawled ahead. "They can hear the shift in air pressure. They know we fled." We crawled for what felt like miles through the suffocating gloom, my hands scraping against rough, damp concrete. The atmosphere was a terrifying, speculative concept, an ancient, forgotten network of drainage tunnels and utility conduits, now serving as the last lifeline for the unmodified. We were rats in the infrastructure of a dead civilization. Finally, the tunnel widened, opening into a dizzying vertical shaft. Mira pointed to a rusted maintenance ladder descending into an impossible abyss. "This is the deep vault transfer point, the old municipal transit line. We descend 300 meters. Faster, Thorne. Their tapping is getting closer." The descent was vertigo-inducing. The deep vault was not a dome built on the surface. It was a vast, inverted city suspended beneath the poisoned world. The scale was overwhelming. When we finally reached the bottom, exhausted and slick with grime, we stepped onto a platform overlooking an immense cavern lit by industrial-strength sodium lamps. Below, thousands of people moved, unmodified humans, pale and drawn, but alive. They wore no masks here. The air was carefully filtered, perpetually recycled, pressurized against the toxic weight above. This was New Eden, or as the locals called it, the Deep Vault. Mira led us through the bustling, fearful throng. The deep vault was a civilization forged entirely out of desperation. Tiers of metallic housing units stacked against the cavern walls, hydroponic farms growing pale, subsidized crops, and at the center, guarded by armed militia, the immense central research complex. As we were ushered into the sterile white of the research citadel, the gravity of my arrival shifted from a personal threat to a communal salvation. Mira delivered me directly to Dr. Alexander Kim, the head scientist. Dr. Kim was a brilliant, hollow-eyed man who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. "Thorne," Dr. Kim said, his voice flat with exhaustion and sudden excitement. He didn't offer a hand. He looked at me like a precious, unstable chemical. "You're a miracle of preservation. Mira said you were hunted. They followed me from Cryogenesis. They knew where I was going before I did. Of course they did. Their sensory acuity for genetic purity is extreme. They must have been waiting for the facility to kick out its last viable sample." Dr. Kim gestured to a vast, humming bank of bioscanners and sequencing machines. "This entire city, Elias, exists for one purpose: to create the adaptation serum. The drug that will allow our people to breathe the outside air without the catastrophic genetic instability that ruined the Silt-Born." He pulled up a complex holographic model of a molecular structure, a rapidly evolving protein chain. "We have the catalyst, the formula, the synthesis protocols," Dr. Kim said, pacing with manic energy. "But we have lacked the final, perfectly stable, pre-decay template to finish the sequence. Every human gene sequence in the deep vault has suffered minor environmental corruption over the generations. But yours is pristine." I realized my fate wasn't merely to be a refugee. I was a reagent. For the next 2 weeks, I lived within the Citadel's research labs. The atmosphere was one of strained, desperate focus. My blood, saliva, and genetic markers were analyzed, sequenced, and replicated hundreds of times a day. I volunteered for every test. I was a scientist myself, and I understood the ethical imperative. I survived cancer 161 years ago only to discover that my simple biology was the single most valuable resource left to the unmodified branch of humanity. I gave them everything they asked for. Dr. Kim and his team worked around the clock, fueled by ambition and the terrifying knowledge that the Silt-Born were growing increasingly bold, occasionally breaching the perimeter defenses of the deep vault's ventilation shafts. Finally, the day arrived. Dr. Kim held up a simple glass vial filled with a clear, shimmering fluid. The adaptation serum was complete. "Elias," Dr. Kim said, his voice shaking with historic significance, "we need a human subject. We need to prove that this doesn't kill you, that it truly allows an unmodified person to metabolize the particulate poisons, to breathe the air outside, without long-term genetic damage. If you fail, the deep vault dies slowly. If you succeed, humanity is reborn." My decision was instantaneous. I chose the needle. I chose the uncertain future over the safe, slow suffocation of the past. The injection was cold, almost painless. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a strange warmth spread through my chest, like the sudden, internal blossoming of light. Dr. Kim led me to a small, isolated quarantine room sealed by a double airlock. He held up a specialized, handheld air sampler. The meter read 30x unfiltered atmospheric contamination. "This chamber cycles in the unfiltered air from the surface, Elias. The air they breathe. The air that kills us." He gave me a heavy, industrial spanner. "When you're ready, turn the valve. And pray." I stood before the large, rust-colored wheel controlling the surface vent. I took a deep, steadying breath of the filtered air, the last truly safe air I might ever know. I turned the valve. The hiss of incoming surface air was loud, visceral. It smelled exactly like the outside, that acrid mix of burnt metal, ozone, and sweet, toxic sugar. The air flooded the small chamber. I waited for the burning in my lungs, the immediate cellular breakdown I had been taught to expect. It never came. I released the breath I was holding, and then, carefully, cautiously, I inhaled the poisoned atmosphere. It felt clean, cold, sharp, but fundamentally breathable. My body, thanks to the serum, was filtering it, processing it, using it. The deep-seated, terrifying vulnerability that had defined my existence since waking up evaporated. I ripped my helmet off. The air hit my face. It was real. I was breathing. A triumphant roar went up outside the quarantine glass. The serum worked. But triumph is fleeting in the abyss. Just as Dr. Kim began planning the mass production, the warning sirens began to blare. A different, more frantic alarm than the usual perimeter alert. Intrusion. Sector Gamma breach. Silt-Born. The deep vault, our sanctuary, was under attack. My arrival had served not as a distraction, but as a map, showing them exactly where the last repository of pure humanity was hidden. The cost of my salvation was about to be paid in blood. Mira, now heavily armed, burst into the laboratory. Her eyes were hard. Dr. Kim, the defense perimeter has failed. We're being overwhelmed at the main access point. We have moments before they breach the citadel. Dr. Kim grabbed a metallic storage case. Inside were a dozen vials of the newly synthesized serum and the only hard drive containing the complete research data. He shoved the case into my hands. Elias, you are the only one who can breathe the surface air. You are the only carrier we have. Mira and I will hold them in the atrium for as long as possible. Get out through the emergency vent tunnel. You must reach Sanctuary Dome 12. It's 150 miles west, high in the mountains. Tell them the formula is complete. Tell them to replicate it. Go. This is the only chance the Unmodified have. The chaos outside was now a visceral wave of sound. Gunfire, the snapping of specialized Silt-Born weapons, and the high-pitched, echoing cries of the dying. I looked at Mira, the woman who had saved me, now preparing to sacrifice herself. Dome 12, are you sure it's safe? Mira gave me a terrible, weary smile. Just run, Thorne. Don't look back. Don't stop breathing the free air. I turned, following the directional signs pointing to the emergency egress. As the research wing doors sealed behind me, I heard Mira's voice, ringing with desperate finality over the internal comms. Hold the line. Protect the vault's heart. I ran, clutching the case of serum vials, leaving the entire history of the deep vault to crash into bloody, chaotic ruin behind me. I was healed, adapted, and armed with the key to survival. A key I was now carrying across the toxic surface, alone, once more fleeing into the infinite darkness. The emergency vent tunnel was tight and smelled of ozone and fresh blood, a horrifying contrast to the regulated air I was now breathing effortlessly. My flight from the deep vault, the sanctuary I had inadvertently doomed, was not just a retreat. It was an expulsion back into the glowing, malevolent atmosphere. I emerged from the surface exit somewhere in the ruins of what used to be a vast, rusted rail yard. The air was cool and thick, the bioluminescent flora thriving here, casting the metal wreckage in shifting shades of blue and violet. I checked the case. 12 vials of the adaption serum, the data hard drive, and a compass set toward the far western mountains. 150 miles. The distance felt impossible, but the alternative, returning to the echoing carnage of New Eden, was worse. I moved with the grim efficiency of a man running on pure adrenaline and historical responsibility. I was no longer Elias Thorne, the dying biotech researcher. I was the courier, the vessel carrying the last hope of the unmodified world. The first day on the surface was grueling. The sheer physical effort, combined with the psychological weight of the assault, began to erode my focus. I navigated through collapsed roadways and across rivers that flowed with oily, iridescent water. I relied entirely on the serum coursing through my veins, occasionally taking a deep, experimental breath just to confirm I wasn't hallucinating the miracle. A grounding fact: the human brain, under extreme, prolonged trauma, tends to temporal dislocation, conflating recent traumatic events with the distant past. As I walked, the memory of Dr. Kim and the dying Mira became inextricably tangled with my initial cancer diagnosis and the sterile, hopeful promise of 2026. The past was bleeding into the terrible present. I kept checking the internal clock. It felt like I had been running for weeks, yet the digital readout confirmed only 28 hours since the deep vault fell. As I crossed a vast, dried basin that still held the ghosts of ancient shipping docks, I received a terrible, haunting message from Vin, the AI that had initiated my awakening. Correction: all major unmodified sanctuary domes, including Domes 7 and 12, reported full operational collapse or internal conflict resulting in resource exhaustion between 2185 and 2187. Your target coordinates are non-viable. Dr. Kim's directive appears to be temporarily dislocated due to stress and distance calculations. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Mira and Dr. Kim had sent me on a ghost chase. In their desperation, they had clung to the hope that a distant haven still existed, when in reality, the deep vault had been the last structured resistance. I stopped, sinking onto a heap of crumbling concrete. What was the point of the serum if there was nowhere left to take it? I was carrying the cure for a species that might already be extinct. My burden, this speculative concept of salvation, felt suddenly like a meaningless, deadly weight. Just as despair began to settle, I saw a movement. Not the graceful, terrifying movement of the Silt-Born, but the jerky, practical motions of surface dwellers. They were human, but different, heavily layered, masked, equipped with crude, jury-rigged breathing apparatuses that wheezed and struggled against the toxic air. They were a community, perhaps a dozen strong, moving in formation, hunting for salvage. They were the Freehold, a name I would learn meant they lived perpetually on the razor's edge, outside the protection of any dome, using scavenged technology to survive. They spotted me simultaneously. Rifle snapped up. Halt. Identity and purpose. A gruff voice crackled over their antiquated radio system. I raised my hands, holding the case of vials carefully. Elias Thorne. Unmodified. From the deep vault. No weapons. I'm carrying medical supplies. They approached cautiously. Their leader, a broad-shouldered woman named Alara, wore a mask that resembled an antique gas mask, its filter heavily stained with rust-colored silt. She studied me through the thick glass of her visor. Deep vault? That place fell a week ago, according to the static chatter. And you're walking around out here without a rig. That's a trick, or you're one of the Silt-Born's modified scouts. I am neither. I took the adaptation serum. I can breathe the air. I reached up, my hand hovering near my face, ready to demonstrate the truth. Alara barked an order. Two men grabbed me, pinning my arms. They were rough, their movements suggesting a deep paranoia honed by surface life. Alara ordered one of them to remove my atmospheric suit's hood, exposing my face to the surface air. They waited for my reaction. I simply breathed, deeply, evenly. The air was sharp, cold, but harmless. A wave of stunned silence passed through the Freehold group. Alara cautiously brought her own crude air monitor close to my face. The meter screamed toxicity. Saints preserve us, she murmured, her voice filled with awe. It's real. You're truly breathing it. I explained the serum, the attack on New Eden, and the absolute necessity of delivering the data. I omitted the part where my target coordinates were meaningless. I needed them to believe I had a destination. Alara and the Freehold immediately changed their demeanor. Paranoia was replaced by reverence and urgency. You're too slow alone, Thorne, Alara stated, and far too visible. The Silt-Born are everywhere now that the deep vault is down. If what you carry is real, it changes everything for the remnants of us on the surface. We have a safe point. It's called the Arkansas. Alara explained that the Ark wasn't a dome. It was a vast, naturally occurring caldera in the high mountains, covered by an enormous, salvaged geodesic ceiling. The last shared structure built collaboratively by both unmodified and modified forces decades ago, during a brief, desperate truce before the final separation. The Ark is the only neutral ground left. It's where the last of the unmodified government hides, and where the central modified leadership resides. It's the highest concentration of both populations. If this serum can be distributed there, it might force a ceasefire. It's the last place on Earth where a solution might be implemented globally. It was the perfect target. Not a sanctuary for the dying, but a staging ground for humanity's last, desperate gamble. Alara organized a convoy, 3 armored, tracked vehicles, retrofitted with heavy armor plating and powerful engines. They wrapped the serum case in protective shielding and secured me inside the lead vehicle. We move high speed, straight through the ruins, Alara commanded. No stopping for anything. The Ark is 3 days' travel. We plunged back into the abyss of the ruins. The journey with the Freehold was terrifyingly fast, punctuated by the roar of the engines and the intermittent, sickly glow of the mutated world rushing past the armored viewports. The isolation was gone, replaced by the grim camaraderie of survival. My reflective thought settled on this. Unity is only ever forged by shared terror. We were the remnants, clinging together against the darkness. On the evening of the 2nd day of travel, while moving through a dense, forest-like cluster of the giant bioluminescent plants, the ambush began. It wasn't the methodical, silent stalk of the Silt-Born. This was vicious, animalistic destruction. A high-pitched, almost mechanical shriek echoed through the calms, followed by the sound of tearing metal. Something impossibly large and fast slammed into the rear vehicle. Feral modified. Alara screamed over the radio. They're extreme evolved, lost cohesion. Hard right. The feral modified were a speculative concept I had only heard whispers of in the deep vault. Silt-Born who had succumbed entirely to the genetic breakdown, becoming hyper-aggressive predators, faster, stronger, and more unhinged than their cohesive cousins. Our lead vehicle swerved violently as the feral modified, gigantic, spider-limbed beings whose pale green skin was now scarred and covered in strange, tumorous growths, scrambled down the ancient, toxic tree lines. They tore the rear vehicle apart as if it were cardboard. Gunfire erupted from the remaining 2 trucks, but the modified beings were too swift, too resilient. They seemed to ignore the crude bullets, focusing on ripping open the pressurized cabins. The middle vehicle exploded in a flash of heat and pulverized metal. My driver slammed the brakes, throwing me against the interior bulkhead. They're after the biological sample, Thorne. They know what you are. Alara shouted, firing her heavy rifle through a gun port. I looked out the viewport. A feral modified, its enormous, black eyes rolling wildly, was scrambling onto the hood, its elongated limbs flexing, ready to puncture the cabin glass. Alara grabbed my arm, her face grim. The vehicle is compromised. You can breathe the air. They can't track you through the deep foliage if you move fast. Go. She shoved me toward the emergency hatch. I hesitated, looking at her, ready to fight. This is my duty, Thorne. Yours is to deliver the cure, she said, before unleashing a continuous, searing blast of fire at the creature on the hood. I tumbled out of the vehicle, landing hard on the rust-colored silt beneath the glowing, alien trees. The air was alive with chaos, the roar of engines, the metallic shriek of the feral modified, and the desperate, fading calls of the freehold. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the serum case, and plunged into the thickest tangle of bioluminescent stalks, running as fast as my 161-year-old legs would carry me, leaving the dying freehold behind. I ran until the sounds of the ambush faded, until the only thing left was the ringing in my ears and the eerie, pulsing light of the mutated forest. I was alone again, the serum heavy in my hand, running toward an arc that represented the last, contested refuge of the human race. The mutated forest swallowed me whole. After the searing chaos of the ambush, the silence here was worse, a profound, oppressive quiet punctuated only by the subtle hiss of the toxic air passing in and out of my lungs. Every shadow cast by the bioluminescent flora seemed to twist into the form of the feral modified. I was now traveling purely by instinct, following the faint magnetic north of my compass and trusting that the arc, hidden deep in the mountain valley, was still a viable destination. The serum had changed me fundamentally, not just biologically, but psychologically. I could breathe the air, which meant I could hide anywhere, away from the pressurized bubbles of both factions. My reflective thought was simple. Vulnerability is a function of necessity. I had nothing left to lose but the serum. I spent the next day moving through high altitudes, the ground turning from silt to fractured shale. I was desperately low on rations, but the knowledge that I carried the key to survival kept the exhaustion at bay. It was during a cautious descent into a sheer, rocky crevice, following the old path of a dried-up riverbed, that I saw the Silt-Born again. Not the feral ones, but the disciplined, tall figures I had first encountered near Cryogenesis. They moved like hunters, precise and focused. I froze, pressed into the shadow of a massive, glowing rock formation. I watched them pass. There were 6 of them, moving too quickly to be casual travelers. They were tracking something or someone. I waited until they were well out of sight before daring to move. I decided to take a huge detour, climbing higher into the treacherous peaks, even if it meant risking a fall. The ascent was brutal, involving scrambling up near vertical rock faces. I reached a narrow ledge that offered a dizzying view of the toxic valley floor and a clear sight of the arc. It was immense. The entire valley was sealed off by a salvaged, slightly opaque dome, a geodesic ceiling that trapped a pocket of breathable air inside. It was a monument to desperate engineering, a final, fragile barrier against the world's decay. As I studied the perimeter, searching for a safe entry point, I heard a sound directly behind me. A light, scraping sound on the shale. I spun around, dropping into a defensive posture, clutching the serum case like a weapon. Standing 5 feet away was a Silt-Born woman. She was taller than me, with the characteristic pale green skin and perfect, jet-black eyes. But unlike the others, she was not menacing. She wore no armor, only simple, dark gray clothing. Her expression was one of intense, complicated relief and sorrow. "Elias," she said, her voice a soft, cultured whisper, devoid of the harsh electronic filtering of the Unmodified. "I thought I lost you again." My blood ran cold. How did she know my name? The Silt-Born were highly intelligent, but they shouldn't know the personal details of an ancient sleeper. "Who are you?" I demanded, my hand shaking slightly. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, ignoring the threat of my posture. The glowing ambient light illuminated her face, and despite the alien green skin and the unnerving eyes, I saw something in the delicate structure of her cheekbones, the faint line of her jaw, that cracked the wall of my composure. A grounding fact: facial recognition is processed in the fusiform gyrus, a region of the brain capable of astonishing pattern matching, even across decades of environmental change and genetic mutation. But the shock of recognition can overload the system, causing temporary sensory dissociation. "It has been 161 years for you, Elias," she said, a deep sorrow coloring her voice. "But for me, it has been over 2 centuries." She reached up, touching her own face with a long, slender finger. "I didn't choose the ice, brother. I chose the change." Eliza, my sister, the younger, wilder sibling who had walked away from our family's geneticist path and embraced the promise of radical adaptation before the Great Decay truly hit. I remembered the arguments, the desperate calls, her absolute conviction that evolution was the only path. I stumbled back, my mind refusing to accept the impossible reality. "Eliza, you survived the Great Decay?" "I survived it, and I adapted to it," she confirmed, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "I watched the old world die. I watched your facility freeze over. I couldn't save you then, but I kept track of your pod. When the power began to fail, I was too far, trapped by resource wars. But I knew when the AI initiated the final, desperate revival." She explained, standing utterly still, her huge black eyes fixed on me. "She married Julian, a rational and gentle Silt-Born leader. They were part of the enlightened faction, those who understood that the division between the modified and unmodified was a death sentence for all humanity. She was the speculative concept that shattered my entire worldview, a bridge between eras, a relative who had traded humanity for survival, only to find survival was a painful, lingering death sentence. You were hunting me. I realized, the terror returning but now overlaid with complex emotional pain. "I was protecting you," she countered softly. "The moment you woke, you became the most visible target on the planet. I tracked your suit's signal from Cryogenesis, followed you to the deep vault. I tried to warn Mira. She was a good woman, but she was too distrustful of the modified to listen. The assault was initiated by the extremist Silt-Born faction, Elias. The ones who want to consume your pure genetics to fix their own flaws, regardless of the consequences. They are dying just as surely as the unmodified." Eliza stepped closer. "Julian and I are part of the leadership that desperately needs your serum. Our genetic instability is accelerating. The next generation of Silt-Born is increasingly rare, increasingly fragile. We are evolving into oblivion. Your serum, the formula for stable, breathable air without biological change, is the last, only hope for both sides. It allows the unmodified to leave the domes, and it gives the modified a pathway back to sustainable stability, a chance to halt the degeneration." The irony was crushing. The serum I carried, meant to save one side, was in fact the universal antidote for the entire species, fractured by fear. "We need to get to the Ark, Elias," she urged. "It's the crucible where this decision will be made. I know the weak points in the perimeter. Julian is waiting inside." I looked at her, my sister, a 200-year-old alien, and the profound, undeniable echo of family flooded my senses, overriding the visual horror of her adaptation. She hadn't changed her core. She was still Eliza, fighting for what she believed was right. The unmodified leadership, they won't share it willingly. I warned, thinking of Director Harlow, the rigid, militaristic leader Mira had briefly mentioned. They see it as a weapon, a bargaining chip. Then we will force their hand. Julian's voice cut in. He emerged from a nearby cave entrance, tall, green-skinned, and utterly composed. He carried a sophisticated energy weapon, but held it loosely, indicating rational intent. Harlow is barricaded in the Environmental Control Center, Thorne. He controls the atmospheric regulators for the entire dome. He intends to use the serum to create a privileged class, safe outside the dome, while condemning all modified to slow extinction. We have located a single point of infiltration into the control center. We need your help. The three of us, the pure genetic sample, the adapted sister, and the rational modified leader, stood together on the hostile mountain ledge, staring down at the last human citadel. The plan was audacious, built on the premise of radical transparency. We wouldn't simply present the serum as a cure. We would use it to destroy the physical boundaries that sustain the conflict. The grounding fact here was the psychological barrier. As long as the two factions physically needed separate air to survive, they would remain enemies. The serum removed that need. Julian used his incredible agility to scale the sheer, synthetic walls of the dome's perimeter without setting off the archaic motion sensors. Eliza and I followed, using the intricate knowledge she had of the decades-old structural weaknesses. We slipped past the perimeter guards, unmodified militia, huddled in heavy winter gear, and into the vast, echoing space beneath the dome. The Ark was a city of perpetual twilight, built against the mountain walls, separated into distinct sectors, the red sector for the unmodified government and the black sector for the modified communities. A literal chasm of filtered air separated them. Our target was the Environmental Control Center, built right over the central divide. I looked at Eliza, my alien sister, standing beside me. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of 161 years of separation and evolution. I was no longer running from the apocalypse. I was about to dismantle the psychological infrastructure that allowed it to continue. "We go now," Julian murmured, checking the energy charge on his weapon. "We are running out of time. The divisions are hardening daily." We crossed the manufactured chasm on a heavily shielded service bridge. As we approached the control center, I held the case of vials tighter. The serum was not a weapon, but the catalyst for peace. And sometimes, peace requires a radical, violent act of unity. The Environmental Control Center, ECC, sat like a bunker atop the largest natural spire inside the Ark's dome, overlooking the fractured communities below. It was shielded by reinforced polymers and guarded by Director Harlow's elite security detail. The tension inside the dome was palpable. The air felt thick with suspicion and impending violence. Julian, with his enhanced senses and knowledge of structural engineering, found a rarely used external maintenance access, a winding, pressurized tube leading directly into the ECC's ventilation system. "Harlow is paranoid," Julian whispered through our shared comms channel, his voice surprisingly warm and melodic despite the gravity of the situation. "He assumes any invasion will come from the surface or across the main divide. He never anticipated an internal breach through his own infrastructure." Eliza moved with unsettling grace, using tiny electromagnetic pulses to silence the automated alarms on the pressure seals. I followed, feeling deeply out of place in my salvaged survival gear, a ghost of the past walking alongside the future. We crawled through the dark, cold ductwork, the hum of the immense air filtration units vibrating through the metal walls. A grounding fact: the air filtration systems of these massive closed-loop environments are the single most complex, and therefore the most vulnerable, points of a dome structure. Compromise the air, and you compromise the entire hierarchy. We emerged through a service panel into a dimly lit corridor adjacent to the main control room. 2 guards were patrolling. They were silently dispatched by Julian, who moved with the fluid lethality of a perfected predator. Inside the control center, the atmosphere was one of strained focus. Director Harlow, a stout man in a crisply tailored military uniform, stood at the central console, barking orders into a microphone. Beside him was Dr. Nora Webb, an unmodified scientist I recognized from old Deep Vault memos, her expression etched with worry and defiance. As Julian neutralized the remaining 2 guards with stunning efficiency, Harlow spun around, his face contorted in disbelief and fury. "Thorne, how did you get in here? And the Modified, you're defiling this sanctuary." Harlow instantly recognized the biological signature of the Silt-Born. "Director Harlow," I said, stepping forward, the case of serum vials visible in my hand. "The Deep Vault is gone. Mira Levinson is gone. This is all that remains." Harlow's eyes fixated on the case. Greed warred with terror. "The adaption serum. You delivered it. Excellent. Secure him. We will begin negotiations with the Silt-Born immediately from a position of absolute power." "Negotiations are over, Director," Elias said, stepping out of the shadows. "The era of separation ends now." Dr. Nora Webb, seeing the serum and recognizing the historical weight of the moment, took a single, courageous step away from Harlow. "Director, we must distribute this universally. To save us all." Harlow drew a small, heavy sidearm. "Traitor, this is the only leverage we have to secure a future for the true human race. I will not allow this technology to fall into the hands of those genetic deviants." He raised the weapon, pointing it directly at Julian. Julian didn't flinch. "You are dying of fear, Harlow, not biology." I knew we had mere seconds before Harlow's paranoia overwhelmed his reason. The serum was the speculative concept that represented absolute power or absolute freedom. I didn't try to reason with him. I lunged at the main environmental console, smashing the security keypad with the butt of the serum case. Sparks flew. "Julian, open the atmosphere. Force the confluence," I yelled. Julian understood instantly. His large, agile hands flew across the exposed panel, bypassing the complex, layered security protocols. Eliza covered us, her demeanor radiating calm focus, holding Harlow at bay with only her silent, unnerving presence. Harlow screamed, firing his weapon wildly. The shot went wide, ricocheting off the reinforced walls. "Stop. That system controls the internal air balance. You'll contaminate both sides." "Exactly," I said, my voice ringing with certainty. Julian punched the final sequence. The entire room went silent as the central status indicator turned from green, stabilized internal environment, to blinking, aggressive crimson, system breach. External integration protocol initiated. Deep in the subterranean engine rooms of the Ark, enormous valves began to groan open. These were the regulators designed to maintain the delicate pressure difference between the clean unmodified side and the semi-pressurized modified side, ensuring the two communities never truly mixed. As the system cycled, the air pressure began to equalize. Crucially, the external particulate filters, designed to keep the toxic surface air out, were deliberately disabled by Julian's sequence. A sudden, fierce gust of air swept through the ECC. It carried the faint, distinctive metallic and sweet sugar scent of the outside world, the toxic atmosphere that had defined humanity's separation for a century and a half. Harlow collapsed, clutching his throat, gagging on the unfiltered air now mixing rapidly with the internal atmosphere. He wasn't immediately dying. The process was too slow for that. But his body was instantly reacting to the poisons the Unmodified had spent generations avoiding. I was breathing effortlessly. Eliza and Julian, already adapted, were unaffected. "It's done," Julian stated, his face serene. "The air is the same now. For everyone." Down in the main plaza, panic erupted. The Unmodified, sensing the shift in the air quality, began to choke, scrambling for long-forgotten emergency masks. The Modified, however, looked up, sensing the pressure drop and the new, heavy presence of the surface air. They felt relief. The separation barrier was gone. Dr. Webb, witnessing the entire, desperate gamble, rushed to the central console and broadcast a message to the entire facility, overriding the alarms. "Hear me. Director Harlow has been neutralized. The atmosphere is compromised. But listen, Elias Thorne, the Awakened, brought the adaption serum. It is not a weapon. It is the cure. He can breathe the air. We must mobilize the labs now. We must mass produce it." The atmosphere inside the Ark was no longer segregated. The physical reality of the toxic air, which now affected the Unmodified community, forced immediate, desperate collaboration. The guards, seeing Harlow struggling and hearing Dr. Webb's authoritative message, lowered their weapons, confused. The threat was no longer an invading force. The threat was the air they shared. I opened the case, revealing the 12 pristine vials. "Dr. Webb, use these. Immediately. Start with the most vulnerable." Eliza stepped to the edge of the platform, looking down at the panicked crowd. Her voice, amplified by the ECC's public address system, was calm, resonant, and carried across the cavernous dome. "We are the same species. We breathe the same air. This divide is a lie perpetuated by fear." Her words, coupled with the immediate biological distress of the Unmodified and the silent, supportive presence of the Modified in their sector, broke the psychological barrier. My reflective thoughts settled heavily. We nearly perished not from the poison outside, but from the fear of the other side. The only way forward was through radical, forced unity. Julian and I quickly stabilized the atmospheric systems, preventing total contamination, but maintaining the shared, filtered blend of air that required the serum for long-term health. The panic subsided, replaced by a desperate, shared hunger for the cure I carried. The immediate aftermath was intense. Dr. Webb, now in charge, organized the remaining scientific personnel, both modified and unmodified, in a frantic push to synthesize the serum in bulk. The genetic information from my hard drive was uploaded into the central mainframe. For the first time in over a century, the two branches of humanity were working side by side, driven by the absolute necessity of mutual survival. I watched as the first doses of serum were administered to the high-risk, unmodified individuals, their gasping relief confirming the drug's success. I saw the modified leaders, including Julian, organizing their people, not for attack, but to help establish distribution lines and security for the labs. Eliza stood beside me, her pale green hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "You did it, Elias," she murmured. "You closed the gap. The true work, the work of rebuilding, begins now." But the Ark was just one valley, one citadel. The rest of the world remained hostile, fractured, and dying. We had won the battle for unity, but the war for survival was still raging across the toxic surface. We had to take the cure to the others. The immediate aftermath within the Ark was a fragile equilibrium, a collective, exhausted realization that survival now depended entirely on cooperation. Director Harlow was imprisoned, not for treason, but for attempting to hoard the essential resource for one faction. Dr. Webb, having seized control of the scientific process, enforced a strict, nonpartisan distribution policy. For 3 weeks, the labs inside the Ark hummed with unprecedented activity. Unmodified and modified scientists worked together, pooling their disparate knowledge. The unmodified mastering the purity of the synthesis protocols, the modified using their advanced materials science to scale up production capacity. Julian proved invaluable, directing the logistical nightmare of resource acquisition and serum delivery within the vast dome. Eliza remained the vital anchor between the political factions, using her longevity and knowledge of the Silt-Born's complex hierarchy to ensure the extremist elements of the modified were kept in check. And I, Elias Thorne, the man who was supposed to be dead by now, became the physical manifestation of the cure, the walking proof that humanity could breathe the same air again. My reflective thought, born of this strange, intense cohabitation, was this: identity is merely context. I was no longer the ancient sleeper, but the catalyst for the next century. The adaptation serum worked flawlessly. Once administered, it altered the recipient's ability to metabolize the particulate poisons, allowing sustained life in the toxic atmosphere without the need for cumbersome breathing gear or the catastrophic genetic trade-offs of the Silt-Born. A grounding fact: in toxicology, the mechanism of bioaccumulation is often species-specific. The serum introduced a rapidly replicating, non-invasive enzyme that effectively neutralized the century-old environmental toxins specific to the Great Decay, making the air inert to the human respiratory system. As the population of the Ark, both modified and unmodified, were vaccinated and began to adjust to the shared, open environment, the physical and psychological barriers between them began to crumble. Unmodified humans left their section to explore the structures built by the modified, finding shared histories and forgotten art. The tall, silent Silt-Born, no longer feared as alien predators, started interacting, sharing survival stories and logistical necessities. The speculative concept that fueled the next phase was the Global Delivery Initiative, GDI. The plan to take the serum and the knowledge of its production to the remaining isolated communities scattered across the ruined world. The Ark could not save humanity if it remained an island of sanity. Eliza, Julian, and I became the core of the first GDI team. There are small pockets of unmodified deep underground, struggling with filtration, and larger communities of modified attempting to stabilize their own dying populations, Eliza explained to a gathered assembly of newly unified leaders. We must reach them before fear consumes them, or before their genetic instability forces them toward violence. The greatest danger wasn't the toxic air anymore. It was the isolation and the inherited fear that had defined 2 centuries. The day we left the Ark was bright, though the sky was still a bruised, sickly orange. We stood at the enormous, northern exit gates, ready to venture into the high peaks and the treacherous, glowing forests. Our team was small but powerful. Myself, the core genetic key, now a skilled tracker after my surface journeys, Eliza and Julian, who provided advanced knowledge of the surface and its mutated inhabitants, and 2 young scientists, an unmodified named Kaya and a modified named Xylos, who carried the mobile serum synthesis lab. As the massive gates hissed open, revealing the immense, alien landscape beyond, I looked back at the assembled crowd. They were mixed, pale-skinned, unmodified, breathing freely, standing alongside their green-skinned, black-eyed counterparts. There was no division, only shared purpose. Julian looked at the immense, towering mountains. The journey will be treacherous. The feral modified are still loose, and there are still leaders like Harlow hoarding resources elsewhere. We move with transparency, I affirmed, strapping the serum synthesis equipment onto our specialized, all-terrain surface vehicle. The moment anyone sees that we are a team of both branches, breathing the same air, working toward the same goal, the game changes. The evidence is ourselves. Eliza nodded, her black eyes reflecting the poisonous twilight. "We are the first ambassadors of the new world, Elias." The bridge is built. We climbed into the vehicle, the engines roaring to life. We drove out of the shelter of the Ark, past the silent, frozen remains of the war that nearly destroyed us. The first stop, based on salvaged, unreliable pre-decay maps and Elias's localized knowledge, was a heavily fortified modified stronghold rumored to be dying rapidly from genetic collapse, a community whose desperation was likely to breed aggression. As we drove away, the Ark shrinking behind us, I felt an extraordinary lightness. My cancer had led me to the edge of the world, only for me to realize that the end of the world was merely a new beginning. We drove for hours, navigating through ruins and across vast stretches of bioluminescent landscape. I drove, feeling the wind, the sharp, cold, toxic wind. On my face, a sensation of miraculous freedom. Julian, sitting beside me, pointed to a distant plume of dense, localized atmospheric contamination, a storm of industrial fallout, heavy and deadly. "That's the direction of the stronghold," he said. "They are running out of time." We accelerated, racing toward the poisoned horizon. Our mission wasn't just delivery, it was persuasion. We had to prove that the only enemy remaining was the division itself. We reached the outskirts of the stronghold just as the twilight faded into the deep, echoing night. The structure was a fortress of fear, heavily armed, suspicious, and isolated. We stopped the vehicle a safe distance away and established contact. "This is the Global Delivery Initiative," I broadcasted across the universal frequency. "We carry the adaption serum. We come in peace. We come as equals. We are modified, unmodified, and the awakened. We breathe your air." The response was immediate and skeptical. A harsh, electronic voice demanded proof. "Send out your team," I replied. "We will meet you halfway. We will stand in the open air, unmasked, and show you the future." I stepped out of the vehicle, followed by Eliza, Julian, Kaya, and Xylos, a tableau of the unified species, breathing the death-dealing air of the Great Decay as if it were mountain spring. We stood on the boundary line, beneath the eerie, pulsing glow of the mutated flora, waiting for the isolated survivors of the long night to emerge and see that the impossible had finally happened. Humanity had chosen to live together. The physical barrier was gone. The psychological one was finally, irrevocably, crumbling into the silt. The journey had ended, and the greater, shared journey had just begun. The glow of the mutated world recedes, softening from that aggressive blue-white to a gentle, almost meditative emerald. The toxic silence remains, but it no longer feels empty. It is filled now with the promise of footsteps, my footsteps, Eliza's, Julian's, moving forward, together. We spent 200 years learning to fear the air we breathe, and another century learning to fear the people who breathed it differently. The Great Decay didn't just pollute the atmosphere. It contaminated the soul of our species, convincing us that self-preservation demanded total separation. I look at the horizon, now visible through the permanent, high atmospheric haze. I think of Thomas Reeves, the man who went into the ice afraid of a few cancerous cells, and Elias Thorne, the man who woke up to save an entire, fractured species. It was the same man, but the priorities were fundamentally inverted. Survival wasn't about holding on